Cool.
Cool. So I think we're going to get started and hopefully there'll be more people joining us. Just to say a really warm welcome to everyone who's joined. Welcome to this online webinar where we're going to be discussing the findings of the recently published Fair Seas report, a climate resilient path for Ireland's marine protected area network. And this report highlights key Irish marine areas that can promote biodiversity in the face of the impact of worsening climate change, helping us to identify the areas of Ireland's marine environment that have the best opportunity to preserve ocean species and habitats for decades to come. So my name is Rosalind, and I'm the Marine Policy and Advocacy Officer at BirdWatch Ireland. BirdWatch Ireland is a science-based conservation charity working to protect birds and biodiversity, and a proud member of the Fair Seas Coalition. Thank you very much to all of you for giving up your Wednesday lunchtime to be here and for your enthusiasm for protecting Irish waters. And we really want this webinar to be a dialogue and as interactive as possible within the constraints of Zoom. And we really welcome your thoughts and your comments in the chat box. So after a short introduction from me and then the presentation from our keynote speaker, I'm going to be moderating a Q&A session where I will invite you to ask your questions in the chat box or to offer some comments for discussion. And really, there's no question that's too small to consider, so we really want to hear from you. As an island nation, Ireland is a nation of swimmers, snorkelers, surfers, and divers, and the Irish population experience a strong emotional, almost spiritual connection to the sea. And wherever you're living on the island, you're never too far from the coastline. Maybe some of you want to put in like favorite areas of the coast or the Irish coastline in the chat, and it'd be great to see where you're all coming from as well, or tuning in from. But as many of you are already aware, for too long, we have operated with an out of sight, out of mind attitude when it comes to our marine environment. And many of you will also know that the oceans are not just vast bodies of water, they're the lifeblood of our planet, providing us with oxygen, food, and other resources that are essential for life. Yet currently, they're experiencing unprecedented threats from pollution, overfishing, habitat destruction, and crucially, climate change, as we're going to be discussing more of in this webinar. So just before I dive into the main topic of this webinar and introduce our guest speaker, I wanted to give a brief outline of the Fair Seas campaign for those of you on this call who may be unfamiliar with it. So Fair Seas is a coalition of Ireland's leading environmental, non-governmental organisations and networks. Our ambition is to see Ireland become a leader in marine protection, giving our species, habitats and coastal communities the opportunity not only to survive, but ultimately to thrive. And you can see on the screen there the logos of some of the environmental, non-governmental organisations, NGOs that comprise the Fair Seas Coalition. So BirdWatch Ireland, the organisation that I'm representing today, but others like Irish Wildlife Trust, Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. And really one of the strengths of the Fair Seas campaign is that it brings together different organisations with a multiplicity of perspectives, and that really enriches and strengthens the campaign and its objectives. So Fair Seas have been taking our message about protecting 30% of Irish waters by 2030 to coastal communities and groups all over the country. We've been very busy. We've been engaging with local groups, politicians, and ordinary people in Ireland who use, love, and rely on the sea every day. For many of them, their livelihoods rely on it. And this campaign comes at just the right time because the Irish government is currently drafting marine protected area legislation. So many of you may have already heard of 30 by 30. You might have heard or seen that before. 30 by 30 refers to targets to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. And this is a target that Ireland has signed up to at a national, EU and global level. As a campaign, Fair Seas exists to ensure that this target is realised and to hold the government to account. So with the Marine Protected Area Bill to be published imminently, this is a very exciting moment for ocean lovers and also for those of us working in marine conservation. The long-awaited Marine Protected Area legislation is at an advanced stage of drafting, and it's due to be published in the coming weeks. And Fair Seas really hopes that the findings in our climate report can help inform the site selection process for marine protected areas in Ireland. So this report that we're going to be discussing today, the climate report, is the fourth report that Fair Seas have published on marine protected areas. It follows our Revitalising Our Seas report, a report which kickstarted the discussion on marine protected areas. The Sustainably Financing Ireland's Marine Protected Area Network report, which tells us how much this is going to cost to adequately resource Ireland's Marine Protected Area Network. And the Ocean Literacy report, which looks at the Irish population's relationship to the marine environment. And this is the report that we're going to be hearing a bit more about today. So you can find out more about all these reports and give them a read on the Fair Seas website. But hopefully that provides you with some policy context and background information to effectively frame this discussion. And now I'm going to introduce our guest, who will be unpacking some of the findings of the report in more detail. After our guest speaker delivers her presentation, there will be the opportunity to ask some questions and to have some discussion. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Professor Anna Queiro from Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Anna is involved in a diverse range of projects and has particular expertise and knowledge of the impacts of ocean warming, climate-smart marine planning, and protected areas. Anna is the lead author of the Fair Seas Climate Report, working with the team of ecologists, researchers, and data scientists from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory to identify which areas of Ireland's ocean are most resilient to the impacts of climate change. Anna, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully then you can share your presentation.
Hi, Rosalind. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to finally share the results of our research. I'm just trying to find the correct screen to share with you. If you bear with me for a moment, you should be able to see that now.
Yeah.
So before we delve into it, I just wanted to actually talk about the value of partnership and how sometimes luck as well. And this collaboration with Fair Seas actually came about through a meeting with Aoife, one of the Fair Seas campaign leads, at the United Nations Ocean Conference a couple of years ago. And these fortuitous meetings can sometimes really lead to positive change. So I really hope you find the report useful and it comes to be particularly of use to Irish nature. I wanted to start the conversation by clarifying a few concepts that I will refer to back through the presentation. So when I talk about areas of interest, I mean the areas of interest identified in the Revitalising Our Seas report that Rosalind had just referred to you, which was the first report that Fair Seas put out around the MPA bill. And so that's what I mean. And then I'll talk about three types of areas, and that's to do with the analysis that we've done for Ireland. So firstly, the bright spots, and those are areas where environmental conditions may improve in the short term. And these are changes that are not consistent with climate change, and they tend to be short-lived. Then I'll talk about climate change hotspots, and these are areas where the climate signal emerges, and that means where climate change is driving the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, into a new state that's really beyond what we see at present. So it's a very different, very altered system. And then climate change refugia, which are really our hope sites, really what we're focusing on in this report, are the areas where, despite the broader pressures of climate change, where the marine ecosystem remains very much within the bounds of what we see today. And those are really the areas where we're thinking about MPA placements. And so the report, A Climate Resilient Path for Ireland's Marine Protected Areas Network, has just been released, and the QR code there on the screen allows you to get to the Fair Seas website and to download it if you wish too. And just a little bit about me. So thanks to Rosalind for the introduction. I'm a principal investigator here at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and I do much work using climate modeling projections for the marine environment to try and understand how we can develop marine policy, and particularly planning and the siting of protected areas and spatial management in general, in a way that is adaptive to climate change. So giving, as Rosalind was saying, giving the best opportunity for our marine species and habitats to cope despite the growing pressure of climate change that we're seeing so clearly now. So the Revitalizing Our Seas report identified these areas of interest around the Irish exclusive economic zone, and the line that you see there is the line of the marine planning area for Ireland, so the naturally marine planning framework area. And you can see there are several areas there identified as of being of interest because they already host species of high conservation value and habitats of high conservation value in high abundance, in high density at present. Now, of course, climate change throws a spanner into all of these efforts because climate change causes long-lasting and very clear changes in the physical characteristics of the ocean, particularly changes in temperature, which we are all familiar with, but also extreme events like heat waves and cold snaps, changes in ocean circulation, changes in the stratification of the ocean, the difference between the surface layers and the seabed, but also biogeochemical changes, so changes in the way that the ocean cycles its nutrients, causing effects like ocean oxygen deficiency and ocean acidification. And these changes in turn affect the structuring of our food webs and the way that the marine ecosystem functions. And it's these changes that in turn affect the potential efficacy of our marine conservation efforts into the future, particularly through altered habitat characteristics or habitat conditions, which lead to loss of species that we in the present see as abundant and important, but also through the arrival of new species. And so we know that these changes occur, as I said, because of changes in the direct habitat conditions experienced by organisms. And let's remember that animals and plants in the ocean, they don't experience each individual pressure of climate change separately. They experience them all at the same time. So the temperature, the acidification, the changes in food availability, the circulation patterns, all of that is experienced by these organisms. And we know that that in turn affects their distributions. In addition, these effects can exacerbate other human pressures like increased nutrient loading of coastal areas, which can exacerbate the negative effects of those direct impacts on these species and habitats. And so these both types of effects, so these direct and indirect effects, have been observed across the Irish waters more generally and in protected sites like Lough Hyne. And so the ambition for this report was really to determine whether the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report are also resilient to climate change, and to understand whether, in these areas where we now have species of high conservation value in a good condition, in high abundance, whether those areas will remain in that way into the future, or what fraction of them will remain in that way into the future. And so numerical modeling, I'm not sure if you can see my bar at the top of the screen. So ocean modeling projections, and particularly numerical modeling, can be used to estimate the degree of climate change experienced by these marine species and habitats into the future. And so, for example, in this particular time series, so you can see the time going by there on the bottom left. And so that's each year there is the beginning of a 20-year period between now and the end of the century. And so we can use numerical modeling to try and identify the sensitivity of different areas of our marine space, or indeed the sensitivity of different species to the different degrees of climate change that they will experience. And that's because climate change does not unfold as one pressure with the same magnitude and speed everywhere, but indeed there are different levels of the pace of climate change and the magnitude of climate change on land as well as in the sea. And so numerical modeling can help us identify where are those very sensitive areas, so the climate change hotspots that are changing very quickly, identified in this figure through the purple triangles. But it can also help us identify those more resilient sites where the pressure of climate change may be slower or in smaller magnitude, what we term climate change refugia. So where these habitats might remain more or less the same into the future, at least for some time. And because of that, ocean modeling projections can also be used to inform on the design of marine protected area networks, particularly through the identification of climate resilient sites that could be harnessed within that network. And so this can then help the colleagues in the agencies that have statutory responsibility for the designation of conservation sites, as well as marine planners, to help determine whether a particular area might be useful in terms of MPA siting, so the siting of a protected area, or whether indeed is an area that has a lower conservation value and then where other human activities can grow as part of our blue economy. So as I said, the first question we were trying to address with this report was whether indeed those areas of interest are resilient to climate change, but also what other types, thinking more broadly about the Irish waters, what no regrets decisions can be made about the siting of MPAs that increase their resilience to climate change, given that we have all these other pressures in the marine environment. And so I would like to quickly acknowledge my authors, which are primarily based here at PML, but also at ASTI, which is another research institution in Spain, and for making their modeling data available for analysis by Liz and I here in PML. And so as a quick overview of the report, which, as I said, you can download if you use that QR code, we use that modeling data per group of species. So we looked at specific groups of species of interest which had been identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report. And for each group of species, and using 2 greenhouse gas emission scenarios, we analyzed all modeling time series, so in the way similar to that plot I've just showed you, using spatial math analysis. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about future climate change, we're not talking about things that will happen. We're talking about the potential futures. And normally within this type of research, we referred to emission scenarios, and those essentially represent different potential pathways to the increase of greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere, which are the main force behind climate change. And particularly in this report, we used RCP, or representative concentrations pathway 8.5, which is a red line on that plot, which is seen by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as the top end, the worst case scenario of emissions development into the future, as well as RCP 4.5, the blue line, which is typically referred to as the strongly reducing emissions scenario, which includes strong reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the middle of the century, 2050. As you can see there on the y-axis or the vertical axis, those represent quite different futures in terms of the magnitude or the increase in greenhouse emissions in our atmosphere, and therefore very different futures with regard to climate change. And so in the report, what you can then find are in the main part of the report are these types of maps that identify key areas which we, through our analysis, identify as climate change refugia for these key groups of species and habitats. And these summary analysis estimate the overlap between those sites and the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report. And then you can also find dates to the resulting GIS data sets that come out of our analysis for onward use, if that should be of use to you. So in terms of a little bit more detail on the methodology, what we did starting from the areas identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report is we take the data sets, time series, so projections for the state of the marine environment between now and the end of the century for climate variables and species distributions that represent the environment and the species of interest to marine conservation in Ireland. And you can find all those sources of data in the report. And then per species or habitat group, and I'll come to that in a minute, we run this specific methodology, which is a robust scientific approach to analyze this climate modeling data, which is called climate signal detection, which allows us to detect when that climate signal emerges in the ecosystem, given all those variables that we considered. So essentially, when the system changes beyond its range of natural variability now because of climate change. And that analysis then allows us to classify the Irish marine area into 3 types of areas. So the climate change hotspots, sensitive sites, the climate change refugia, the resilient sites where the environment remains more or less the same, and the bright spots where changes might occur temporarily, which are contrary to the long-term trends of climate change. And those tend to happen because of climate cycles and because of oscillations that have to do with ocean circulation and atmospheric processes. And so from that classification, we then obtain per 20-year period between now and the end of the century a climate resilience map for each of those key groups of species and habitats. And those are within each emission scenario. So remember the higher emission scenario and the lower emission scenario. And then from that information per 20-year period, we can then construct a time series, which is what you see that in that animation there, as I showed you earlier. And onto that time series, which condenses that information throughout the 21st century, we can overlay information about the structure of our blue economy, so the distribution of all our marine activities, including our conservation sites and the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report. And from that, we can then extract the summary maps that condense all of that information across time and across emission scenarios to help us answer the two questions. Are the areas of interest identified in the report climate resilient? And what no regrets areas could host these climate resilient MPAs into the future? And that is the basis of the climate ready special advice provided in the report. In the Annex 1, you can find an additional range of technical information, including information about all the modeling data sets used, so they're clearly and transparently labeled, including their sources, the temporal and spatial resolution of all of our analysis, all of the GIS data sets that we considered in addition to the modeling data, as well as the protocol for the creation of the summary plots and the shapefile creation. And the shapefiles are the GIS data that results from our analysis that can be used by end users of the report. In addition to that, you find all the supplementary figures I will mention today. So the time series that include the dynamic propagation of the climate signal through the Irish waters under the two emission scenarios and the overlay of all the blue economy GIS data, as well as the conservation sites and the areas of interest in the Revitalizing Our Seas reports. And so very quickly, the key findings of the report. So the report is structured around predominantly these four groups of species and habitats. So the megafauna relying on the water column prey and habitats, like basking sharks, megafauna reliant on seafloor prey and habitats, like puffins, as well as angel shark, water column species, like herring that congregates in the upper layers of the ocean, and the seafloor, the benthic species. And so for the megafauna relying on water column prey and habitats, we found that the refugia, so these areas in green, and you can see that you can find the legend at the top of all of the plots, overlaps with some of the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report, but they overlap a little bit with the currently designated site. And so there is an opportunity to expand the conservation of protected sites for these types of species in a more climate resilient way. It is to note that the white areas, so the white areas being the sensitive areas, they include most of the inshore waters, which could be particularly problematic. And if we look at the time series around that, you can find that some of those sensitive areas host a number of other human activities. But the resilient sites also host a degree of particularly oil and gas leases and fishing pressure. This is a typical picture of a marine area in a Western European country, where we have a very packed mosaic of human activities. But what we can find from the report is that there is opportunity there, even despite that complex background, to offer more protection for these types of species. In terms of seafloor, megafauna reliant on seafloor and prey habitats, we found that those areas, again, extend predominantly to the west and the southwest of Ireland, with some patches in more inshore waters here and here. And those areas, in these cases, also overlap with sites that are already designated or candidate areas, as well as many of the areas identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report. And very similarly, in this case, we also had quite a lot of human pressures, in particularly in the inshore waters, including dredge dumping and other types of pressures here, particularly in the East Coast, where it's a very busy human activities mosaic. But in the more offshore areas, particularly to the southwest, we have opportunities there to present conservation for these species as well in a climate resilient way. For water column species, so pelagic species beyond the megafauna, the patterns were similar, identified in similar areas as for the megafauna, but with a greater extension. And for the seafloor species, that we found indeed quite a lot of areas, particularly in offshore environments, in deep environments. And this has been identified as relating to some of the climate pressures on our circulation patterns, which mean that the expression of climate change in these deeper waters is somewhat slower in the century. There are also inshore waters which are classified as well as refugia for benthic species, and these indeed overlap with a number of activities, including potential leases for development of the wind sector here on the top panel, as well as other areas. And in these particularly inshore areas, we also find here in these plots, which you can look at in a lot more detail in the report, we also have an estimation of light pollution, which is in these inshore areas can be particularly important and affect benthic sea fauna as well. So lots of things to consider there, but again, a panorama where we have many areas of interest overlapping with climate refugia for benthic habitats, including some sites which are already designated. And so the key messages of the report, if we take it all those areas together, looking at all of the species together, and here the refugia identifying climate resilient sites for at least one of those groups of species and habitats, what we find is that, you know, particularly the white areas, the sensitive areas tell us that climate smart MPAs are needed given these estimated effects of climate change in the Irish marine environment. So we have quite a lot of impacts estimated in quite a substantial proportion of the Irish EZ. But about 60% of the Irish National Marine Planning Framework area, corresponding to about 67% of the Irish EZ, actually host long-term climate change refugia for at least one group of species. So I should say that these climate change refugia identified in the report are found to stay there for at least 40 years, and they correspond to over 280,000 square kilometers of the Irish EZ. So there is quite a lot of potential to build from this complex scenario of impacts. And so with regards to the question one, the overlap of the identified climate change refugia with the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report, protecting those, at least those areas of overlap, would lead to an increase in the protection of climate resilient sites in the Irish EZ to 29%. And if we only consider the currently designated sites, only 77% of the refugia of the Irish EZ would correspond to climate change refugia. So quite different, an order of magnitude difference in those numbers. And so including those sites, so that overlap between the climate change refugia we identified and the areas of interest identified in the Revitalizing Our Seas report through an expanded MPA network in Ireland, do present an opportunity to support effective conservation of these Irish marine species and habitats for decades to come, which is really about those no regrets decisions we were talking about around question 2. And so that action could help meet Ireland's commitments under the EU 2030 biodiversity strategy through an MPA bill that is also climate resilient. I just would like to take a moment to acknowledge our funders. So this project was actually funded in partnership with Fair Seas through the European Commission, through the Call for Knowledge that was assigned to the Future Maris project. And we also benefited through UKRI Research and Innovation funding through the M-Space project. And thank you very much for your time. Please, I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive overview of the findings in the report. And yeah, thank you for reminding us as well of the importance of looking at the climate and the nature crises in an interconnected way. You know, the Dáil declared a biodiversity and a climate crisis in 2019. So it's important that we think about how we can tackle biodiversity loss and also climate change in a way that's holistic and integrated. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. I would encourage people, if they have any, you can even, you know, raise your hand and maybe tell us who you are, the organisation you're representing, if any, and any question, because I know this is a very emotive topic for many, looking at the interconnection between the climate and nature crises. Would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I'll kick off. Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you, Anna. That was a fantastic overview. And I've read the report, but it was really good it's much more clear even in my head now, having you gone through it so well. So I'm the Fair Seas campaign coordinator, and I just had one question, and I know this was really in the scope of the report and the work, but how does or does it do well implemented MPAs have an impact on climate modeling, the outcomes of climate modeling scenarios, as opposed to maybe not well implemented MPA networks or non-implemented MPA networks? Is that another factor that might be hard to get to grips of, but do you think would in reality have an impact?
Thanks, Donal. That's a great question. In the modeling that we use in this particular report, we don't include the effect of MPAs on the species analyzed and the habitats analyzed. It can be difficult to quantify that effect or to get it correctly parameterized, but I am involved. We are doing work currently, also through the Future Mares project, in fact, in the North Sea, where we are using that approach, where the potential effect of the MPAs on the marine environment, on the species and habitats modeled, is accounted for in the projections. And then we can contrast different scenarios where different degrees of effects are found. So for example, MPAs that are very restrictive, where no fishing activity can take place, relative to MPAs that allow for some extractive uses relative to others. And actually what we find in those studies is that, which is interesting and it's not published yet, but what we find is that it's quite interesting to see that the climate resilience of the marine environment in some areas is actually supported through the presence of an MPA, whereby at least the model suggests that removing that pressure from other human activities actually enhances the resilience of the habitat to climate change, which is really interesting. That is not, in terms of observational data, that is not something that is uniformly observed across all of the areas around the world. So we know that in some cases that has not been the case. And a good example, for example, is the pelagic fish community in the North Sea, which so the water column fish, which in some areas, the North Sea being an area where fishing pressure is very well regulated, relatively speaking, relative to other areas of the world, and where we found that in some areas the community has bounced back very well because that those pressures were put in. Sorry, that the curb of those pressures was put in through fisheries management. But in other areas, you simply don't see a comeback of the species, and that's because climate change is just so strong that there's no, they're much smaller, and so so it is something that should definitely be taken into account, but it's not something that we considered in this type of modeling because it's difficult to parameterize.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, Donal. I'm just going to go to one of the questions that has popped up in the chat from Richard Truman, and he's asked, Anna, have you considered carbon sequestration in sediments within MPAs as part of the project?
Yes, though not in this report. So we have done that work in the past, in a previous study, which I actually referred to in the presentation. So a few years back, we did some preliminary similar studies around Ireland. At the moment, it was at the time when the National Marine Planning Framework was being developed. And so we were asked to look at this as well, using the modeling data that was available then. And we did look at carbon sequestration potential around Ireland. And we did find that using the modeling, you can find these areas of high sensitivity and low sensitivity also in the processes that lead to carbon sequestration. So even though carbon sequestration is one of the main way really through which the ocean contributes to the regulation of our climate system and the harvesting of that carbon into these long-term reservoirs, those processes, those biogeochemical processes, are also sensitive to climate change, and the degree of sensitivity of the Irish seafloor varies geographically and over time. So we have done some preliminary work around that. The challenge there, as with many aspects of modeling, is that the models in themselves used to make those estimates are not very skilled at the moment, because there is not huge amount of data on these seabed processes and their sensitivity to climate change from observational data. So so whilst we can make projections, they're not necessarily representing very well the ecosystem at the moment. So it is something that the community is looking at to improve into the future. But if you're interested, yeah, we can share that preliminary study we did a few years back, which provides an initial picture around
Thank you
that.
very much. That's very helpful. And you obviously shared your email in the presentation. So yeah, Richard, you can go to Anna's email for that if you want further clarity. And then a question here from Carol. How can you protect our seas in the absence of naval or other resources?
Naval resources, as in the
Navy,
the military.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question, but there is definitely an issue with compliance at sea. You know, the sea is a huge area, and unregulated activities happen everywhere around the world. Now, in our area of the world, we have mechanisms in place, you know, such as, you know, the way in which vessels have to report their positions all the time, that allow for agencies to track, you know, poor behavior in terms of compliance with legislation that is in place. That is not always affected, obviously. No country has a record of 100% compliance with marine law, and particularly in terms of restrictions around MPAs. But Ireland is, you know, a better place than many other areas of the world where, you know, unreported and unregulated fishing, for example, is a huge problem, which is then reflected in very poor management and poor condition of marine species and habitats. So so there are different ways that don't necessarily involve, you know, military action, because there are these systems in place that, you know, most people abide to, but it is indeed a problem.
Yeah, thank you. And a comment and a question here from Tabitha. So delighted to see the Cork and Kerry coasts as an area for consideration, a really beautiful part of the Irish coastline, because it hosts a lot of sea and wading birds throughout the year. And Tabitha asks, Anna, that you mentioned angel sharks in your talk, and I know there are only 2 or 3 places in Ireland in which they're found now. Will you be focusing more on areas which hold these endangered species?
So we, in particular, don't have any plan to do subsequent work at the moment. What we hope is that the report is a good resource for this conversation around the future marine protected areas in Irish waters, and that you know, that resource can be used to identify where particular studies on species of high conservation value, like angel shark, could be protected. So that requires a lot more detail into the specific requirements of that one species than the approach we used in the report, which is more of a broad view of the ecosystem.
Cool, thank you.
I hope that answers, yeah.
Yeah, and then 2 questions here from Susie Can. So the first one is, what similar work has been done for UK waters, specifically for Northern Ireland, and how might these interact with the recommendations from this report and the research associated with it? Yeah, let you answer that question first, actually, because and then maybe we can go on to the second one.
I almost feel like that's a planted question by someone in our team, because we actually we've just released a report this week around similar work we've done in the UK through the MSpace project, which I mentioned there at the end. And that work has looked not just at marine conservation, so it looked at the marine conservation sector across the UK nations, including Northern Ireland, of course, and their sensitivity to climate change, but it also looked more holistically at other sectors, including fisheries, aquaculture, and then the full lens of marine planning, so all the cross-sectorial interactions between those focal sectors and all other marine activities. And that climate change report, which is called the Early Warning System, is available on the MSIP website. I can put a link here. And in particularly for Northern Ireland, it's one of our case studies in the project that's been taken forward, combining that climate change evidence, translating it into metrics that people are find more tangible, particularly through the planning process, which is in a highly consultative process, by translating them into things like the number of jobs in Northern Ireland, costs or gained to particular sectors in the Northern Ireland economy, and then combining that with the social views that views that people hold in terms of the marine environment. And it's those recommendations that combine those three types of evidence that are then made for Northern Ireland. So I'm very happy to share the link to that other report, which also, obviously with Ireland and Northern Ireland being such a close adjacent marine area, they're probably quite interesting to look at together.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think there are quite a few people from Northern Ireland on this call, so I think that would be really interesting and useful for people. And Susie's second question, Anna, again, is especially quite relevant to Fair Seas, given that we do a lot of community engagement. And Susie's asking, how can this report be used in current actions by communities engaging in conservation or restoration work in inshore waters to focus their efforts in terms of the refugia? And I think that's very relevant for a lot of the NGOs who are on this call.
Absolutely. And so I can't possibly suggest what the best way to use it is, because that's really not my expertise. But what I can say is that the resource is written in a way that is hopefully accessible to local communities. And our idea is really to empower people with having the access into that climate change evidence. And that's why the report is written in that way. And the summary maps are produced, which condense quite complex climate change modeling evidence into something that's perhaps more tangible, which are those summary maps are focused on. The sort of the green maps I focused on in the presentation, and they're in the main part of the report. And so the report is written in really accessible language, producing these visualizations, which are, I think, easy to understand. And the idea is that local communities engaged in the designation process, engaged in the planning process, can then use that evidence to help support discussions around, the climate resilience of their particular area and particular habitats that they love and want to protect.
Thanks, Anna. Here a question from Erin. So really useful. She's thanking you for the presentation. And then quite a specific policy question. So she's saying, when highlighting climate refugia, is there a risk that this could be seen as a sole solution and result in less urgent action from policymakers on the reduction of emissions? So how do we emphasise the need to urgently reduce emissions alongside the results from this report? Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the main sort of top line message across all of this type of work is always that the best outcome for the marine environment is always to reduce emissions. And that's why we also look at contrasting emission scenarios to really, demonstrate the difference. And if you look at the Annex 2, where we show the time series, and we also always show them between, the contrast between the lower emissions future, which is really what, our best guess at the moment is that RCP 4.5, which is a 2-degree world, and the much higher emissions trajectory, which hopefully we are not on anymore, is really to show that difference. And so that's always the top line. That's the best outcome. But up until the time when that happens, and we have to be cognizant that these processes of decarbonizing the global economy are going to take many decades. We have climate change effects locked into our climate system. Our climate system is already altered. We already have a huge excess of greenhouse gas emissions. And so even if we cut all emissions today, we would still have climate change effects for decades to come. And so in that interim period where we have been able to slow down the pace of climate change, where we have stabilized the climate system, we need to have these time-buying strategies for our marine biodiversity that can serve more or less like the seed banks into that future state where we have, a more amenable ocean environment, which is under less pressure from climate change, and where species can thrive more widely. But until then, it's these very localized pockets that we need to really focus our effort on. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and ultimately we won't meet our climate targets without nature restoration and vice versa. So
absolutely.
Yeah, emphasizing that a fossil fuel phase out is like not divorced from this work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have our Ocean Action equals Climate Action banner here in the office as well. So yeah, thanks for that question, Erin. And then Emma, sorry I didn't get to your hand earlier, but yeah, you've put your question in the chat, which is good. So Emma's saying that she sees most of the climate refugia are quite far offshore. And these would be outside the foraging ranges of many vulnerable species of seabirds in particular. Has this been addressed?
No, so it has not been addressed in this particular report because seabirds are actually grouped with other megafauna, and we looked at them primarily whether they were feeding primarily on the surface waters, and that's particularly the prey that they were interested in. Many birds rely on the presence of surface thermal fronts, which are these particular features, oceanographic features, where there's quite a big aggregation of the lower food web levels, and where they are used as foraging grounds, or whether they were feeding on the seabed. Some birds, deep, like puffins, they dive all the way down to the seafloor to catch their prey. And so, and they are aggregated within this analysis, which is really a broad scale view at conservation in Ireland. They are grouped with other types of megafauna, like sharks, like cetaceans, like sharks and rays, depending on where they feed, basically. And so I think any efforts to preserve particular species in Ireland can build from this report by looking at these areas and then looking in much more detail into the specific requirements of that group of species, particularly for those seabirds. But some seabirds forage really far offshore as well, so it really depends on which species we're thinking about.
Thanks, Anna. Another question. I feel like this is quick fire. You're in the hot seat, but this is from Aoife. So would these MPAs need to be managed somewhat differently if they've been chosen primarily for their climate resilience? And would the climate resilience of the MPA require ongoing monitoring, as that was the basis of its designation?
Yeah, so the idea is not that the sites are designated just because they are climate resilient. So this is why we did the overlay between the areas of interest, which are biologically meaningful now, and the location of the refugia. And so because of that, the management of that area is whatever is appropriate to maintain a good status for those features that were used in the designation of the site. So the biological component, what species and habitats are we trying to protect with a particular site? And so the management of that area doesn't necessarily need to be different because it's a climate resilient site. It needs to be appropriate to whatever the features are. But the idea is that, especially in conversations with the colleagues in policy, is that we have all these multiple goals for our marine areas, particularly, in the context of climate change, the growth of the renewable sector, which are going to take up so much space, and we need them. We have so many people whose livelihoods rely on the ocean, and those activities are important. But in addition to that, can we think about how species are redistributing because of climate change, where are they not redistributing to, and have that temporal dimension also in our considerations. And so not just about where species are now, but where they will remain into the future. And that's particularly important in the siting of MPAs, as well as the siting of long-term infrastructure like renewable infrastructure. So having a view of where those changes might happen and how is really important in the way that we bring those different objectives together.
Thank you, Anna. And another question here from Kieran. So he's asking, is it possible to comment on the importance of these potential climate refugia in a wider European/North Atlantic context?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I missed the first part.
Yeah, sorry. So is it possible to comment on the importance of these potential climate refugia in a wider European-North Atlantic context?
Sure. So again, sorry to sort of blow our trumpet, but it is true that we are looking at this through that Future Maris project. And so the idea is that, of course, the sites around Europe will be designated for different types of species than perhaps the ones we considered. So it's important to remember that the Irish context is not necessarily meaningful for species in other areas of Europe. We are doing the same type of analysis across European waters. So the idea is that we would be able to have in the next 6 months, more or less, a view of where these climate refugia are throughout European waters. And the idea would then be for that to serve as part of the criteria for the basis for a well-connected MPA network across European waters. And of course, some of these areas are important corridors for migratory species, particularly because of the location of Ireland geographically. There are important areas as corridors for species that migrate between the Atlantic Ocean and other parts of Europe. And so there are aspects to look at that, particularly around the location of corridors, making sure that corridors are also climate resilient. And again, in those cases, the consideration of changes in oceanographic features like the fronts is especially important. Now, that's not something that we looked into a lot of detail in this report. This report is really focused on the panorama of Ireland to start a specific type of conversation around the MPA bill, but it's part of this sort of portfolio of activities that we have across European institutions working together in the same way.
Thanks, Anna. And a question here from Patrick. He's saying the refugia for marine megafauna were very far offshore in deep water, if I remember correctly, from your presentation. So does the report therefore suggest that there'll be a wide-scale loss of inshore megafauna in the coming years?
That's a really interesting question, and it's an important point to clarify, I think. So thank you, Patrick, for asking that. No, so we are not saying that megafauna will be lost for inshore areas. What we are saying is that the habitat characteristics that they depend on now and the prey that they depend on now is going to change very much in the coming decades as a result of climate change. And so if you look particularly at the time series in the Annex 2 of the report, you can see the progression of climate change. But again, there is the uncertainty of the two emission scenarios. So the summary maps that I focused on, the green maps, they are the areas of where the refugia show a high agreement between a future with lower and higher emissions. And so it's important to also look at the time series to think about, if the climate action we are putting in place now will bring us down to this RCP 4.5, what does the future for Irish waters look like, which is a more optimistic view. But starting the conversation through all of these nuances is difficult, and hence, the reason why we created these more sort of higher level, sort of simplified visualizations in the main part of the report. It is also important, as I've mentioned earlier, that the report looks at the aggregated environmental conditions in prey fields for many species. So we have a table. This work builds on previous work we've done in Ireland. We have tables of what are the key species, what do they feed on, what are the environmental characteristics that they need, and then they are lumped into these big groups. And so it's important to then look in a lot more detail into the requirements of particular species rather than just the generic maps that we produce in the report. But hopefully that's a starting point for that conversation.
Thank you, Anna. And I don't think we have any more questions, but there are some interesting comments in the chat. So thank you for everyone for your contributions. From Belinda, just around the MPA Europe project is compiling a database of blue carbon sediment data for Europe's seas, and will also model networks of MPAs which factor climate change effects on species. So that could be helpful for Fair Seas to compare results when we have them next year. So thanks, Belinda. And as well, Tabitha, thank you for your clarification also on the naval boats. And yeah, as well, just that comment from Ronan around hope that this research is reaching and being listened to by the politicians and executives in departments who have the power to apply its findings in a constructive and timely manner is obviously a very relevant point. And I'm going to thank Anna now for her contributions, and then following on from Ronan's point around sort of like advocacy and how we can channel this energy and this concern around the state of our marine environment and the water quality around us into something positive, I'll be talking a bit about what we can do and how you can get involved in Fair Seas. But thank you so much, Anna, for all the questions and taking all the questions and for answering so comprehensively and for all your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm going to share my screen again.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'll just log out then. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have Anna's email. It's, if you should see my screen, you'll be able to as well see her email there. So you can also get in touch with some of her some of your questions if you want like further clarification, or if anything resonated with you. This is just a final wrap-up slide from Fair Seas then. So to thank you all again for tuning into this lunchtime webinar and for taking an interest in finding out more about our campaign as to how you can work with us to protect 30% of Irish coastline and waters by 2030. And there's several things that you can do to support the campaign, which I've highlighted on the screen. So back in October 2023, Fair Seas launched a petition calling on the Irish government to protect 30% of Irish seas by 2030. And in a period of 3 short weeks, we garnered over 10,000 signatures, demonstrating the huge public appetite across Ireland for marine protection. And the amount of you here today really engaged, I think, is also testament to that. And many of you on this call will have already signed that petition. So thank you if you did. And we would encourage you to sign or share the petition if you haven't already, and you can add your voice to the rising tide of sea stewards in Ireland calling for healthy seas. The second point there is about contacting your elected representative. So against the backdrop of the local, the EU and the potential general election, we would ask you to use your voice at this time to advocate for marine protection. This is the time of year where politicians are coming knocking on our doors asking for votes. And we would really love for people to communicate that protecting the environment is a ballot box issue to them, and that marine protection is something that really matters. And next week, we're going to be launching a tool where people can take action by emailing the ministers responsible for the MPA bill, Ministers Darragh O'Brien and Malcolm Noonan, asking for them to publish the bill. So you can keep an eye out on Fair Seas social media for that tool when it launches. And yeah, we would ask you to engage with it and share it widely. And finally, if people want to get involved and support the campaign, you can follow all the updates on Fair Seas social media, as well as the social media of the coalition partners like BirdWatch Ireland. And Fair Seas is always on the road, hosting events, popping up at venues, and trying to meet and talk to as many people as possible. So do keep a lookout for events that are happening near you. And Biodiversity Week is just around the corner. It's happening from the 17th to the 26th of May, and World Oceans Day is also coming up on the 8th of June. So definitely lots to get involved with and lots to look forward to. But thank you once again for coming along this lunchtime. It's been a really positive way to kickstart the month of May. And if no one has any further questions or comments, then we can leave it here. And all that's left is to wish you a wonderful rest of the day. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Anna. See you later.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much.